Hi, today we are making buns. So this is a recipe that Jillian requested be sent to her. And so I'm going to show you how to make buns today. The bread recipe is very similar, other than you don't put some of the eggs in it and a little less sugar, but both recipes are very similar. So today we're going to do buns. And out of the bun recipe, you can make your cinnamon buns, or you can make your regular buns, or the buns that I stuffed with pizza filling or whatever, sloppy joes or whatever mix you wanted to put inside the buns. So the bun recipe, when you make it, you can use it in a lot of different ways. This video is going to be done in a few parts because, as you know, you have to let the dough rise. So I'm going to show you how to mix it up first in the first video, and then I'll show you how to punch it down, and then how to put it into pans in the next couple of videos. So stay tuned. So I've already got the water ready. So we start with I'm going to make, starting with 4 liters or 1 liter or 4 cups of warm water. You want the water warm enough that it's going to dissolve the sugar, but not so hot that it'll kill your yeast. So it does need to be warm to the touch. And so I usually just put it in the microwave for a few minutes, or boil the kettle on a lower heat level. You don't want it boiling for sure, but often you need it a little bit warmer than it's going to come just out of your tap. So I'm not going to make a huge batch, so I'm going to use just a 4-cup measure of water, and I'm putting it into my big bread pan. So this is the bread pan that I'm using today, and you can see, it's basically almost 3 hands wide. It's a fairly big pan. And so the size of the batch is going to depend on how big your pan is. So this is the pan I'm going to use. So I'm going to add to that my sugar that I've pre-measured. So this is 1/3 of a cup of sugar. And then we put a little bit of salt. So just every recipe requires some salt because it does help with the flavor. So I just put a teaspoon in. I don't put a lot of salt in. And then just want to take your whisk and get that to dissolve. I always use granulated sugar, plain white sugar. I don't know if you could use other sugar or sugar substitutes. It's still a little bit warm. So I'm going to just add a little bit of cold water. Another maybe cup of cold water just to bring the temperature down a little bit. It's still kind of warm to the touch. One of the other things you need to make sure to do before you make buns or bread is take your rings off. Otherwise you end up with bun dough in all of the cracks. So that's probably about the same temperatures as you warm up a baby's bottle. So that's about how warm that water should be. So not so warm that you can't keep your hands in it. Next is the yeast. So I'm using the Fleischmann's yeast. You can buy special bread yeast if you want. I just use the general purpose yeast. And we're going to put 2 tablespoons of yeast. And you just sprinkle it across the top of the water. And so this is active dry yeast. Some of it requires you to let the yeast actually sit for a while and start to blossom or bloom on top of it. This is what I use, the fast acting, which means you basically can just throw the yeast in and then you can start cooking. So pay attention to what kind of yeast you have purchased to know if you need to let the yeast do any blooming before you move on to the next step. So this is where the recipe is different for buns than it is for bread. So everything we've done so far, we would do if we were making bread. So the biggest difference between the 2 recipes is eggs. We don't put any eggs in bread, but we put eggs in buns. And sometimes people also substitute some of the water for some milk. I don't. I just use water. And then we just want to make sure we get the eggs mixed in. I'm using organic eggs. Those were for medium eggs. So you would put in more eggs if you were making a bigger recipe, but 4 eggs is generally fine for 4 to 6 cups of water. So we've got the salt in, we've got the sugar, we've got the yeast, we've got the eggs, and now basically we're going to keep adding flour until we get the dough to the right consistency. So I've got a big bag of flour. I'll show you. My bag is a big bag of flour. And so this is where you kind of make a mess in your kitchen. And so I'm just going to start taking 1 cup measure. Use whatever measure you want. Not so much about measuring at this point. We're going to keep adding flour until we get the dough to the right consistency. So I usually start by adding 2 or 3, or maybe probably 4 cups to begin with, and mix that in. So I've now got probably 5.5 cups of water in here with the water I added for cooling. I'm using my whisk until the dough gets thicker, and then I will switch from the whisk to my hands. I'm just using unbleached all-purpose flour. You can use different kinds of flours in your dough if you want to make them gluten-free, or you want to do something with a whole wheat flour. I haven't experimented a lot with that, but I do find that if you are going to put gluten-free flour in, you probably need to add more yeast. And if you're using a heavier flours like a whole wheat flour or buckwheat or other types of flours, you may find that you need to put a little bit more yeast in your dough because the flour is a little heavier. So it needs a little bit more help from the rising agent. So you can see the dough is starting to come together. So I've got about 6 cups of flour in at this point. Now I'm just kind of adding 2 cups at a time, and I'm using the whisk more like a spoon than a whisk at this point because the dough is getting very thick, but I don't yet want to put my hands in it. My hands will just be pretty gooey at this point. I think my hands are going to go next, so I'm going to just pull all the dough out of the spatula, out of the whisk. And I'm going to start using my hands from this point forward. So your hands will get sticky and gooey. And so then one of the things I do is I keep kind of one hand clean, so I can keep putting that one hand into the flour, and the other hand I start using to mix the dough kind of one-handed. Still probably 2 cups need to go in at this point. And then just put your flour around. That's more to save your hands than anything else. And then we're just rubbing what's built up on the sides of the pan into the dough. And we're just really going to be using a cup, your hand cupped, and just moving the dough around, gently pushing the flour into the dough. And now we're going to start kneading it. And you're just turn your bowl, take your dough, hand over, push it in, hand over, push it in. And this is the kneading process. So kneading is really important because it helps get the gluten going in the bread, which is what helps it rise. So this is still a little sticky, so the dough is still coming back on my hands. So we're going to take it down now to add 1 cup of flour at a time. So I don't want to add too much flour. We want to keep adding flour until you've got all the flour mixed in and the dough stops sticking to your hands. That's when you know that you've put enough flour in. I'm just going to rub this off. Keep rubbing down the sides, flour that's on the bottom. And you can see it's still sticking. So we're still going to need a little bit more flour. I'm going to make sure this is mixed in first. And you can see how the dough is coming together as we need it. Put another cup in. And that might be about all we need. I'm going to punch some of the flour in and then knead the rest of it in. At this point, if your bowl's not big enough, you could dump it onto your counter and you could knead the rest of your dough on your counter. So you can see now that the dough really isn't sticking to my hands anymore. Just clean my hands off so that you can see that it's not sticking to my hands anymore. See, it's not sticking. It is not sticking to my hands. So the dough is pretty much ready, and now we're just going to put a little bit of margarine or oil or grease around the outside of the pan so as the dough rises, it doesn't stick to the side of the pan. And put a little bit of butter or margarine, whatever you want, on the top, and then we're going to put it into the oven to proof. I'm just going to get some oil. I'm just going to use a little bit of canola oil today because I don't have my butter thawed out, so it's frozen. There's Dad sneezing in the background. Just going to take the brush a little bit on the top to keep it moist. You don't do a lot of oil, it's just a little bit. And I don't know why I do this, but my mom always did this, poked the fingers into the bun dough. So I do that. And then we're going to cover it and let it rise. So I usually put one layer of plastic on it first, and I just use old chopping bags. And I cut them up. My scissors have disappeared from my kitchen, so I'm just going to rip it. And I'll just cover it with a plastic bag. And then I cover it with a couple of clean tea towels. That keeps it warm, so your bread needs to be in a warm place for it to rise, for it to proof. And so depending on what your temperature of your house is, you might just be able to leave it out on the counter, which is what my mom always did, was leave it out on the counter. What I'm going to do is use my oven to proof it. So my older oven actually had a bread proof setting on it, and I could just click the bread proof setting, and I could proof my bread. But my new oven doesn't have that setting, so I'm going to use a loaf pan and boiling water because I'm going to create a little bit extra warmth, and I'm going to have that humidity to help my bread proof. So I'm going to just fill that loaf pan up with some boiling water that I had boiled earlier. I'm going to to put that boiling water in the oven. So I just sort of set that on my lower rack in the oven, and I'm going to put the bread in the pan onto the next. Close the oven door and set your timer for 15 minutes. 15 minutes from now, we are going to take the bread and buns out of the oven, and we're going to punch them down. So we're going to do that 4 times. So it's going to rise for an hour. So we're going to do 4 15-minute intervals, punch them down. So I'll start the video again when I'm doing the last one, which is when we're going to be punching the bread down and putting it into our pans or our shapes for what we want to make. So until then, talk to you later.